So on this St. Patrick's Day, I'm going to start with the not so festive Irish potato famine and use that to start thinking about how agroecology, one of my favorite words, not necessarily quite a word that's popular all over the nation, but one of my favorite words, and food sovereignty really are able to address the problems that we face in food systems and sustainability, and really in my mind are the chief solutions to the problems that we see. But first, Juliet mentioned that I have a PhD in ecology, so my work was with farmers and food policies and ants in Brazil. Ants were the indicator of biodiversity and sort of environmental quality. So ants are still close to my heart, even though I don't work with them so much at IATP. You guys actually managed to escape the participation activity I was going to have everyone do. I just made IATP staff do it instead, which was to everyone to draw a picture of an ant. And so we have a variety of interpretations and degrees of anatomical accuracy.
Right.
We've got this one, which is the only one I think that was titled. Proper art display there. And a couple other examples of varying degrees of specificity. And just to remind everyone, this is what an ant actually looks like. You might have forgotten with some of those previous pictures. But actually there's a couple more drawings. There's this one, which actually is pretty close. And I gave people, an afternoon, most people took probably about 5 minutes or so. So this one's pretty nice. And then I cheated a little bit. One of my former students drew this one over a period of days. But the point of the exercise, maybe this one's more fair, was to show that when you have a whole diversity of people or organisms or whatever, it's pretty likely that one or more is going to suit some kind of need or be able to adapt to the situation at hand. So you have, just from a really quick this afternoon series of sketches, at least one that's actually pretty close anatomically to a good sketch of an ant. Given more time, you can even find someone just in a crowd that has the diversity to have the background to do this. And the great thing about diversity and adaptation and evolution is you get these big surprises, so you even can get something like this. It's totally out of the field. But who knows, maybe we'll need that. So the connection with this, connection between this and the topic of the talk and the Irish potato famine, when potatoes were introduced into Ireland, there were basically about two genotypes introduced. The lumper is the one here. And what we ended up seeing, I think as most of you know, is a pretty devastating disease, the potato blight rather, Phytophthora infestans, I think. And so you have this oomycete, not quite a fungus, but related to them, that caused this infection and wiped out a huge portion of the potatoes in Ireland. The potatoes had come to be one of the staple crops of the poor and the working class in Ireland. So I think as many of us know, this had a huge impact on suffering, starvation. There's estimates of up to 1 million people having died from starvation, as well as a huge amount of immigration out of Ireland. The thing is, from having introduced two genotypes, having this disease affects a quarter, maybe up to half of the potato crop, what you don't see here is the fact that if you look at the origins of diversity of potatoes, there's tens, hundreds of varieties of potatoes. In the Andes, which is where most of these are from, there's just tons of variation. And in a very simple way, what you can see in terms of evolution and diversity and its importance is if you think about just the original crop, if you have all of them are cloned from the same genotype or from the same two genotypes, and it happens to be susceptible, there goes all your food. This blight actually was in the rest of Europe. It has been found in Mexico. It has been found in the Andes. It's never reached the level of the Irish potato famine because of all the diversity. And actually the really interesting thing is with this diversity of potatoes, researchers have found that the way farmers use them is that they know if they plant some subsection of these, not every farmer plants all of these, every single year something's going to work out. Whether it's dry, whether it's a drought, whether there's this kind of pest or that kind of pest, one of these is going to be able to resist it, and so they're always going to have some kind of food. So the value of diversity is from a biological standpoint, is the raw material for evolution and adaptation. It's what makes evolution even possible. Both within farming and within wild ecosystems, it also can provide stability and insurance. And so, like I was just talking about the variety of potatoes, they also serve different cooking needs, different cultural needs, but so you've got this whole expanse of different things to draw back on. And there is actually plenty of studies that show when you have a wider diversity of crops, you have more stable yield. Sometimes you actually even get higher yield, but definitely you get year to year less variation in a whole variety of crops in a lot of different places around the world. In many cases, when you plant certain crops together, you get what's called over yielding, or you get more than just the additive of having, A and B. You actually get 120% of those two things together, rather than if you planted them apart. So you can really boost your productivity if that's what you're concerned with. And actually, the value of diversity may be part of this somewhat of another mouthful, but the inverse productivity relationship with farm size, which is that study after study has shown actually smaller farms are more productive per unit area. And one of the reasons for this might be, it's actually not very well understood, but it could be that if you look at any piece of land, naturally it actually has some diversity. That there's parts that are soggier, parts that are drier, parts that are higher, parts that are windier. And a smaller farmer has a greater ability to treat each of those parts differently and to actually plant differently, rather than trying to treat it as one large factory floor, which it is not. And so it takes extra energy and probably lowers your yield somewhat the more you have this variation over land. So diversity, agroecology, and food sovereignty are all tied intimately together. I'm going to explain a little bit about what agroecology and food sovereignty have to do with all of this. But diversity, I would argue, is at the core of both of them. Cultural diversity, human diversity, biological diversity are really what allows us and what the benefits of these systems are based on. So what is agroecology? The sort of popular among professors, popular definition these days is that it's a science, a practice, and a movement. So I'm going to go over what each of those means. I'm going to show why it addresses some of the problems and has potential for progress in our current system, how it's a solution, and then how it ties to food sovereignty. So agroecology as a science, it's pretty intuitive what it basically means. You've got agriculture, and ecology. As a science, it draws on both ecology, which is a bit over 100 years old as a field, and agronomy and horticulture, which are much older. But to really think about how ecological systems work and what they have to teach us about how we can improve agricultural systems in terms of being internally cycling, more efficient with resources, and more productive, more environmentally benign. Agroecology, also the science, combines sociology, history, political economy, many of the things that Juliet listed. That's, if you wanted to list all of them, that's why I have all of them in my background, because I consider myself an agroecologist, and I think true agroecologists have some degree of familiarity with all those different parts, because you have to worry about not just the environment, environmental quality, and the ways that you can use your knowledge of the environment to make farming better, but also the farmer. The farmer is a really key part of it, and something that you can't lose track of. So the sociology, the economics, those elements are all really important to understand as well. So it uses the tools of this and other fields as well to really describe scientifically agriculture and food systems, to also evaluate the effects of agricultural systems on the rest of the environment. So we see climate change. We've read a lot actually recently about the dietary guidelines and looking at sustainability elements of different kinds of diets. And as I said before, it uses examples from nature to improve the sustainability of such systems, improve what you might call their true efficiency, and often their social cultural impact, improving the impact on workers, on eaters even, and throughout the system. Agroecology, as a set of practices, draws both on cutting-edge ecology, the science of the environment and interaction between organisms and the environment, and traditional practices, agricultural practices that have been conducted for eons, for thousands of years by different kinds of farmers. And I like to think of it, sometimes people say, well, this is nostalgia for a bygone era that we've already improved on. But I like to think of it as the combination of the cutting edge science and the traditional practices that we know, like, okay, democracy was invented by the Greeks, pretty different system we have today. But we don't say, well, we have nothing to learn anymore from Athens. We say, well, we have some things to learn, some things we change. from all of our traditions, intellectual heritage and cultural traditions, some things we keep as we find them to be of value, and some things we say, well, we need to modify based on our current understanding. And so I think ecology is the same, looking at systems that have lasted for a long time and saying there's value there. That's the definition of sustainability, lasting a long time. And if there's problems with those, then we change them. If there's things that work, we keep them. So there's a whole variety of practices that come out of that, from crop rotations, polycultures, integrating crops and livestock, which we have moved away from. And so it's this brilliant idea of taking a system that, to a large extent, is a cycle that keeps materials on the farm and keeps them cycling through the system, into two different problems. How do we get rid of waste from animals, and how do we fertilize crops? And so it seems like the opposite of progress when you create two problems from one solution to me. There's also the use of natural predators, which there's really cool work in a variety of areas. And actually, I hadn't even thought about this before, but one of my colleagues at my former institution at Washington State University had done some really cool work on potatoes, on organic agriculture, and he actually found that it was both cheaper and more effective at preserving yields because the pesticides killed two different predators, that one was above ground, one was below ground, and that they killed most pests that preyed on potatoes in Washington at least. And so actually it was better to be organic. It's just one of those things that people hadn't realized, and he really thinks that's going to take off quite a bit once we start realizing more of the ways we can promote that. But then in that case, done the right way, it's cheaper not to apply pesticides, and these natural predators eat and attack and infect everything that you worry about getting on your destroying your crop. The other nice thing about natural predators is they evolve too. So there's something called a pesticide treadmill. As you use a pesticide, you tend to kill off a whole ecosystem, including the predators. Well, then something new comes in that eats your crop, and well, all the predators that eat that are gone. But it's not an automatic thing, but when you have natural predators, there's the possibility that they're going to adapt and eat some new thing or keep things in better balance. So it's never perfect, it's never 100%, but I think you improve your chances of that happening, as opposed to pesticides where you end up in this cycle of always trying to find the next one. Cover crops, especially green manure, another practice that comes both from tradition and current science, and many of us probably have heard of precision agriculture and big data and the potential of all these different new computational whiz-bang technologies we have, which are, they all can be used for good and in interesting ways. The interesting thing is that I have a couple of colleagues that have done the research on this. The most effective ways to reduce nitrogen runoff, which causes all sorts of problems for the environment, actually is through green manures and these other sort of more agroecological methods. That precision agriculture tends to be, you try and get your machine that puts a fertilizer on, you have the precise amount, the right area, you can use GPS to make sure it has the right amount for the right area, and that actually still has more runoff than methods that are more traditional or are a combination of tradition and modern science. So agroecology as a set of practices has a lot to offer, and just like natural predators, it keeps evolving because we have the science there. We have scientists in universities, we have farmers on the ground who I sort of consider the world's bulk of agroecologists, the billion or so farmers around the world developing practices on the ground because they need to. And so we have that continuous innovation that I personally think having a couple companies have really bright people trying to think about how to solve everything is just not going to be as effective actually as having many people trying to solve it, especially if we properly support them and allow them to have a sustainable livelihood. Agroecology is also a movement or a set of movements, depending on how you think about it, but we have things from La Via Campesina to recently we had the Midwest Soil Health Summit, and they were very keen on the word agroecology, on the methods of agroecology, so we see it starting to penetrate a bit more in the United States, where internationally it's a little bit more commonplace and understood. But there's a specific reason I think that it's important that agroecology has a movement. For one thing, if you think about how large-scale change happens, and I think most of us agree that large-scale change is needed, those result from public investments, from social involvement, and from activism. They don't just sort of happen by themselves. If we think about even the Green Revolution, which is sort of the best example of how modern technology has helped with all this progress from a certain point of view, that resulted from huge public investment. And actually, does anyone know why it was called the Green Revolution?
So that they wouldn't think it was communist?
Well, kind of. So not exactly they wouldn't think it was communist, but because there were communist revolutions at that time, And a U.S. Department of State spokesperson said, well, we want to use these technologies to have a green revolution instead of a red one. The idea is if we can just make lots of food so it's really cheap for everyone, then it'll be a green revolution where everyone will be happy with capitalism and no one will have a red revolution. Ironically, actually, that some more recent research is saying that producing a whole lot actually might not help the poorest, because many of the poorest are farmers and low prices are not so great for them. So there's actually some interesting contradictions even with that attitude. But that is where the name comes from. But that was resulted from this wave of social upheaval around the world of people wanting an alternative system. So even the Green Revolution came from this social pressure, even if it was manifested in a way that I think wasn't necessarily the best way. And if we think more broadly, improvements in labor conditions and gender equality, racial equality, food access, like in Brazil where I've worked for a number of years, and they've seen an unprecedented reduction in the poverty, severity of poverty. All these have been fundamentally shaped by social movements. And so you can't just have the right practices, you can't just have the right science, you need people on the ground who care about it and are pushing for it. And so agroecology has that, and I think even in the United States, people aren't necessarily using that word, but the same forces and desires are there. So I'd say agroecology as a movement seeks to improve farmer livelihoods through collaborating with farmers, with researchers, with society, to design and use more sustainable practices that also support farmer livelihoods. And then there's food sovereignty, which is a term that's about 25 years old. You could argue that this is the political arm of policy reform for agroecology. They're definitely closely associated, especially because Via Campesina, which is a very large international movement, of which there are several US members, they've decided that food sovereignty is one of their political axes. They have food sovereignty, they have gender equality, they have agroecology. But the nice thing, when I first heard the term food sovereignty, I actually have been researching a couple years, and I remember telling Peter Rossett, who was the person who introduced it to me. Some of you might know him, he was ED of Food First for many years. He said, food sovereignty is really where it's at now. I said, well, I think politically that makes sense. Politically it's what we should be pushing for, but in terms of the analysis, in terms of the science and people in academia and graduate students, food security still is a better umbrella for thinking about how we analyze this, especially if you define food security the way I do, and you'll see that in a bit. But over time, I've actually come to think that not only as a movement, but actually also as an intellectual project, food sovereignty is really important. Again, it's not a term that's yet popular in the United States, though we do have the U.S. Food Sovereignty Alliance. I think it is growing. I like to say I don't think abolitionism was a common term when it first started. But if you think about it more deeply, there actually is a lot from food sovereignty that makes sense from the research point of view. So I should probably say what food sovereignty is. The most basic definition being the right of communities and societies to define the kind of food system and kind of production they want for themselves. And that's kind of vague. Well, who is the community, who are the society? To a large extent, this ties into a lot of the localization ideas we have right now. And I think, again, there's a really interesting and strong scientific basis for them. So one of them being the work of the late Nobel Prize winner Eleanor Ostrom. She was, of course, the first woman to win the Economics Nobel Prize, and her work over decades was looking at how people cooperate to govern local resources. And she found that they can, and they often do, given the right kinds of institutions, the right kinds of connections. Basically, she was ambivalent about this, but a set of guidelines that could help promote and sustain sustainable communities. I like to summarize it as strong local control is a necessary but not sufficient condition for sustainability and more just systems. And so probably you guys don't care, but I still have the scientist mind. And so people say, well, that was just this set of studies, that you can't say that for everything. We don't know it works for all sorts of systems. These were certain kinds of systems. But actually one of the things that occurred to me when you think about it is, it's true, she looked at thousands of case studies, but it was only a certain kind of system, common property resources. But if you look at other kinds of governance, actually I would say no one's even done that with them. With representative democracy, with republicanism, smaller republicanism. And so arguably it's the most empirically validated form of governance that we have, because she's done all that work and no one else has of the same rigor with any other system. So anyway, strong local control, that's one thing that allows communities to define what they want. And as I'll say later on, I think food sovereignty therefore has a certain characteristic of being freedom plus responsibility. The local community has the freedom to define what kind of system it wants, how that system works, but the responsibility, of course, to worry about how that interacts with other systems and how that interacts with their own system in terms of long-term sustainability. I think also you look at localization and strong local control and forms of sovereignty, and you see philosophers and scientists for over a century have been thinking about this. There's a recent book called The Localization Reader that goes through a lot of these different thinkers talking about the local, and actually even Keynes, the economist who's somewhat been in the news past couple of years with his ideas about economic stimulus. He actually was quoted as saying, even though he's a believer in trade, which is a very elementary economic idea, that where possible he'd prefer crafts, wares, foods, wines to be local, that we should make what's possible locally, and what isn't possible, that's when you trade. So I think that between these different bodies of thought and scholars and work, that actually food sovereignty I think does hold together, not just as a movement, not just as an ideal, I would say, like democracy, but also as an intellectual framework that I would say does rival food security. So probably most of us don't necessarily need a huge refresher, but to go through the problems of the current system and why we need an alternative like agroecology and like food sovereignty. So for one thing, we see right now that farmers, I'm not sure you can read this, but farmers get around 19 cents on the consumer dollar. 30, 40 years ago, that was around 40%. And so we see a lot of these other people getting involved, and when you look at farms that are more locally involved, you look at our farm to school work, that a lot more of that money stays in the community, a lot more of that money comes back to the farmer. And so food sovereignty would be a case where these people could get together and say, well, how much do you think is fair for the farmer? Right now it's just left supposedly to the market, but there is such thing as concentration and monopoly power and market power. We see highly concentrated corporate power, and that is what, in my opinion, has squeezed farmers down to 19 cents, not some kind of natural evaluation of that's what it's worth for them to make the very thing that we're selling in all these other steps. So that is certainly a problem. We don't have, I would say, proper costing of the system in terms of environmental costs, in terms of costs to families, to farm labor, to farmers themselves. We have a series of what you could call market failures. And then indeed, one of my mentors, Cecilia Rocha, who's an economist, argues that it is a market failure, especially food insecurity, that we would all be better off in a system that was more sustainable, with farmers having a better, more secure, larger portion of the pie. And so market failure, if you need an excuse, is a classic reason for government intervention. And there's many, many negative environmental effects. At least one estimate puts the unpaid for environmental costs, both to labor and the environment more generally, of agriculture in the United States is around $30 billion a year. And that was in 2001, so that was about 30% of the agricultural value of that year. So given other estimates, between 15 and 30% of the costs of agriculture aren't being paid, or they're being paid, but with our health and indirectly through our taxes, they're not being paid up front. And so we think about that, that's another way that farmers who are farming well, who are farming as good stewards, all farmers are doing their best, but those who are really actually accomplishing this important work, well, there's actually plenty of value that we're not paying for that they should be getting, and we can think of a variety of ways for that to happen, not just necessarily subsidies, but certainly I think we need to recognize there's a huge portion of money that's just not going to the right place. It's coming out of our health. It's not coming out of our pockets to benefit people in our own community. Beyond that, so you have plenty of environmental problems like use of toxic pesticides, monoculture, which I'm not a huge fan of. I like to say nature abhors a monoculture. The use of a lot of the world's water for agriculture, and plenty of dead zones, dozens of dead zones around the world where runoff makes it so that nothing can live in a body of water. The most famous being, of course, in the Gulf of Mexico, which it's always the size of some state. I think Connecticut is the most current state size it is. A huge area where fisher folk are losing out as well as people who might want to use it for recreation, and of course all the life that would live there as well if it wasn't being killed off. There's also a nice recent paper that looked at organic versus conventional systems and just looked at, again, well, what's the worth of the things that we aren't counting, that we don't pay for up front, the environmental quality, the labor quality. And so they found that organic has almost twice as much benefits to society as conventional agriculture. So again, we talk about actually the price crunch with organic, and there certainly is a challenge for people who don't have adequate money and have insufficient wages right now to pay for it. But again, we need to think about maybe addressing minimum wage, as many people have suggested, and the true cost of food and the true benefits of food, instead of thinking that we should keep getting away with not paying the real costs and the real benefits. So there's a variety of things that try to look at this. There's true cost accounting right now, which is one of the big pushes, but you could just call it trying to have accurate cost accounting. But however you want to look at it, the underlying problem, I think, is that we tend to hear more and more about production, about producing more and more. The growing population need more. We need more for food security, but I'm going to show you, food security is not a matter of production. We need more so farmers can make more money. Farmers do need to make more money, but I would argue that, again, is not just a matter of producing more. And we need to improve environmental impact, one of the ideas being, oh, well, we'll produce more food in less land, but that actually also is not how it works out. When you start intensifying and growing more food on less land, it doesn't end up saving land somewhere else. That's sort of a nice fantasy idea that doesn't tend to work out in real life. So production is, I think, where we see so much of the focus, and we need to know that that's not the issue. That was not the issue in Ireland with the potato blight, besides the fact that the productivity of potatoes went way down with that, but they were still exporting at the same time. And there were actually a lack of controls in exports. The British Crown decided the free market should figure out how this can work out, which you saw also in India, which also exported food during famines. During almost every single famine, exported a large amount of food, estimates saying that they could probably feed the population that was there and was starving. So arguably over 100 years, but certainly the past 30 years of research have shown that hunger and starvation are very rarely the result of insufficient food availability. Amartya Sen, another economics Nobel Prize winner, pointed out that they're usually caused by an inability to access food, and poverty is usually the primary reason behind that. So to give some specific examples, in 1995, 80% of malnourished children lived in countries that had more than enough food. In the United States, the average per capita intake, what comes into our homes, we throw away, of course, as we know, and hear more and more, 25 to 30% of this, but 3,800 calories per person per day comes into our homes. At the same time, 12 to 16% of us can't make sure that we have enough healthy food every single day. We don't necessarily have the levels of acute starvation seen in other countries, but what it does mean is people are choosing between medicine and food, or education and food, and making choices that make no sense when you have almost 4,000 calories per person coming in and going to the garbage and going to our waistlines. And then India, which produces actually more than enough dietary energy within India, and in fact has at the same time not just the highest prevalence of underweight children in the world, but approximately an equal number of malnourished people as the entire continent of Africa, which gets lots of attention, rightly so. There's lots of issues in Africa, but it's not, again, just a matter of production. If it was, India wouldn't have these problems either. And this is actually a graph with the area representing the proportion of all stillbirths. So this is not precisely the same thing, but this is basically how a graph of child malnutrition would look as well. So India, again, which produces more than enough food on a per capita basis, is taking up a huge amount of the problems in the world. So it's, again, not just production. So my preferred framework to think about this, at least before food sovereignty, was what I call, or what Cecilia calls the 5 A's of food security. Cecilia Rocha is an economist in Toronto and one of my dear friends and mentors. And so the 5 A's of food security are not just about availability or having sufficient supply. That's there, you have to have sufficient supply, but the other 4 are just as important, and practically speaking are usually the ones where you start seeing problems: over availability. So there's accessibility, people having access to it both economically and physically, which we see around the United States as well as around the world. Acceptability, looking at culturally acceptable food as well as nutritionally adequate, so that if you hold halal or kosher or vegetarian, that you shouldn't have to violate your beliefs or your culture just to feed yourself. Appropriateness in terms of sustainability and food safety both. So agroecology has a lot to say, of course, about appropriateness and ways to make food systems more sustainable. And then what Cecilia says is the most important of all the A's, and which to me actually goes right back to food sovereignty, is agency, just political agency. That if you don't have the ability to seek redress from your political system, to seek to change your political system, then no matter what, these other 4 A's are not going to be secure. You have to have the ability to petition your government, to determine your government, to reform the rules, as Ostrom would talk about. That's one of the most important ways to make a sustainable system, is not just to have good rules, but the ability to change the rules. And so you have to have that agency in the people to accomplish anything else. So if we look at how food security actually happens, we don't need to belabor this point, but hey, there's a lot of factors beyond just food productivity. One of the really interesting ones you see here from this work by actually staff at the International Food Policy Research Institute. You see full incomes, household full incomes here. So I mentioned minimum wage earlier. You know, the ability to have enough money or resources and rights to take care of all your other basic needs is going to impact your ability to take care of your need for food. You have to balance and compromise between all these other needs as well. And if you look at how this practically manifests, if we look at how hunger's been reduced in the developing countries between 1970 and 1995, there was a recent study that actually updated this and found basically the same thing. Only 26% of the reduction in hunger during the Green Revolution, essentially, was from increased production. And actually, you could probably even quibble with that. But looking empirically at all the data at how hunger was reduced, 75% of it was other factors, with the largest one being increases in women's education. You also have health environment, which was access to clean water in the case of their study, and women's status, which, so again, this is probably not a detail you need, but it's such a cool little geeky detail, that the way that they measured women's status and women's equality in society was the ratio of longevity. Because, as I think most of us know, biologically, women and men who have access to the same resources and health infrastructure, women tend to live slightly longer. And they figured, well, if you have equal political rights, the first thing you make sure is that you live, well and down long enough that you're able to. And so when the ratio is higher longevity for men than women, that's probably a really good indication that women's status are not equal yet. So I just thought that was kind of a clever way to get at that really hard to measure idea. So just in other words, over 50% of the decrease in malnutrition comes from women's equality and women's education over the past, over that 25-year period and even since. So summarized another way by 2 researchers, that increasing women's agency was twice as likely to increase food security as any other factor, as increasing production particularly. And just to really, really hammer his point home, I love this piece. So this is a graph some of my students made. It's a qualitative graph, but if you look at raising these 2 things to the optimum level, so having the optimum production in a society versus having complete equality in women's primary education or secondary education, if you raise the number of calories to the optimum level, then there'd be a worldwide decrease in hunger by about 5% they found. If you increase women's education to the optimum level, there'd be around an 18% decrease. So it's sort of the tortoise and the hare. I mean, that productivity gets up, moves up faster, but it has 1/4 the potential. So it's just, again, we need to focus on the movement side, the political side, not just the techniques and not just the science. That said, the science that practices and movement depends on and seeks important policy changes like attention to gender in order to achieve their goals. And food sovereignty recognizes not just the importance of social change broadly, but the importance of direct conversations within your communities, with your fellow community members, and across communities. And if we think about this, as I said before, it's almost self-apparent that the way we've gotten many of the improvements in society is from exactly these kinds of conversations, from suffrage and civil rights to labor and environmental justice. Having these hard conversations is a really key point. So if we go back to the beginning of this talk, we think about the Irish potato famine. I mentioned that they were still exporting food there. There were also a lot of issues with landlords and rent and political representation, that you have all these policies and this lack of democracy, this lack of autonomy, that arguably even more than the potato blight is at the core of that great tragedy. If you look at the work of Mike Davis in late Victorian Holocausts, you saw in India and China and Brazil almost the exact same thing, where again, they were exporting food from a place that saw hunger. When they connected it to international markets that allowed them to ship grain away from the poorest areas to people who could pay more for the food. If you look at after World War II, almost the same thing happened. The British Crown borrowed money from the Indian country to help pay for their war efforts. They said, well, you're part of the world, so you have to help pay for the war efforts. Okay, well, sure, we'll give them that. But of course, after the war, they decided they're going to pay them back at below market rates and not pay the full amount that they were due, and keep pushing India to change to export markets, to exports to Britain. So you saw continued hunger and famine in India after the end of British rule, as they said, well, no, you still owe us plenty of money for the time that we were occupying you and borrowed money from you. So you saw, again, hunger being caused not by a lack of productivity in India, but by political arrangements. You see in Brazil, where I've worked for many years, that it's more than productive enough to provide enough food for everyone. In the past 20, 30 years, they've implemented a series of policies that were explicitly based on the idea that access was a key problem, not availability and production. And as I said before, in the United States, obviously we have more than enough food, but also more than our fair share of problems. So food sovereignty, as I mentioned, I think it really talks about communities. It talks about, to some degree, scale. And I think we've got some hard questions on scale. One of the most interesting new frameworks I've come across is something called cognitive democracy. Another one of those terms that doesn't trip off the tongue necessarily. But there's plenty of research finding that diversity is one of the best ways to find solutions to your problem, just like the drawings of ants at the beginning. Whether your ant is your Aunt Anne or your ant is a biological ant. But so they found that difficult social problems are most likely to be solved when there's a high degree of direct communication, which I would argue is most possible, of course, within communities with diverse viewpoints, and that beyond that, or a degree of relative equality was really important in decision makers, so that ideas couldn't be imposed on different stakeholders. And so seeking this, I think, is the big challenge that we face. I think that trying to provide systems that give us the spaces to do this is our next great challenge. And to me, I've been thinking about this recently, sort of what comes after capitalism. What are the rules, what are the systems that allow us to make these spaces and allow them to continue? And then just staying on the issue of scale, which can be a tricky one, I do think that the science is pretty consistent and clear, actually, that there's it varies system to system, but an optimum size for farms in terms of productivity, and that at some point you start seeing lower productivity, I think for the reasons I said before, that you have this diversity in land, when you try and treat it all as a monocrop, or all as one uniform thing, that you run into problems. And this is another graph of the exact same thing, that as cultivated area increases, the actual yield per unit area decreases. Now, of course, the net, or the gross goes up. And actually, I was just talking to farmers in Michigan, where my mom's from, and they were explicitly saying, well, we've seen a decreasing net. We've seen a decreasing amount that we get on each unit. So of course we have to expand. Of course we have to have more units. I think many of us have seen that constantly. But I think we need to address that not just by going bigger and larger and better, but by, bigger and larger, but by going better, by actually rewarding farmers for the work they do in stewardship and providing food for society. As well, around the world, is for preserving the diversity that I talked about at the beginning. So if you look at this is from an international study of farm area and the diversity of crops. And again, you see the diversity of crops going down as farms got larger. It's really actually hard to collect this kind of data, so this is, maybe there's a different pattern if you looked at every farm ever, but this seems to be the trend. And so I think even in the United States, we need to think about how do we support our farmers with what they're doing now, but also support them to transition towards other kinds of systems and approaches that are going to preserve diversity that we're going to need for climate change, for social change, for our cultural heritage. And you also see a variety of really interesting bits on farm size and community well-being. Walter Goldschmidt found decades ago that communities that had more smaller farms actually had higher well-being. They were happier, they had more local businesses that were doing better. Tom Lyson at Cornell University, or he was before he passed away about 10 years ago, found the same thing. William Lockeritz, who was previously at Tufts, found that organic agriculture kept more money in the local community because you're not buying chemicals imported from far away, but you're buying things from your local community. We also have seen in our own work, as well as work from the USDA and a variety of other people, that buying locally has multiplier effects, that you employ more people, that you keep more money in the economy, and it grows within that space rather than lining the pockets of a corporation somewhere. So coming all back down to it, I think, like I said before, food sovereignty is not just a political agenda, though it is that, but it also has these great scientific bases, these great intellectual frameworks. There's a lot that supports these ideas and makes food sovereignty, the freedoms and the responsibilities, a really key part of agroecology, of the sustainable agriculture I think that we need for the future. So with that,